We're talking to you, okay.
Yep.
It's a question of where on the camera you have me framed, I don't know.
I might pipe in with a few too.
Yep, no problem.
A little bit closer. There you go.
Yeah. All right. Can I have you say and spell your first and last name for me?
Okay, it's Ricky Becker, R-I-C-K-Y, B-E-C-K-E-R.
Good.
Yep. Well, you got a level
And what's your title?
I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences and at the Lake Erie Center at the University of Toledo.
Okay, so what's really going on with Lake Erie? What is causing the water to be so green?
Well, we have algae blooms every year, and algae are what basically are the food for the lake. But in the late summer, we have what are called blue-green algae, which are potentially toxic, and so they can produce toxins. They can produce toxins which are harmful to people, to dogs, to animals of all different types. And that's in recent years when we've had a large amount of nutrients entering into the lake. We end up with a high amount of algae. That's the algae you see forming these scums on the top and also making the lake this blue-green color.
What's been causing them all lately?
So one of the big contributors to the algae blooms in Lake Erie is the runoff from farm fields and nutrient, but we also have some nutrient input from things such as input from things such as some of our wastewater treatment when we have wastewater overflows. But the primary source of the nutrients of phosphorus and nitrogen are from runoff from farm fields. And so that's entering into the lake, and we put fertilizer on the farm fields to make the plants grow. Unfortunately, algae are also plants, and they grow well when they respond to that fertilizer.
Now, what can we do to try and help the stop of causing these algae blooms?
Well, one of the primary things done is that actually trying to implement some what are called best management practices on the watershed. And so farmers can have different choices about how and when they apply fertilizer and how much they apply. And so there's a program, right rate, right time, right place, and right amount. And so there's really understanding what needs to go onto the farm fertilizer, onto the fertilizers on the fields, but then also different management practices which have been found to be beneficial, some of which include having so cover crops or application of the fertilizers at the right time and the right types of fertilizers.
Is this the worst year that algae blooms have been showing up, or has there been a worse year?
We've had different years with different magnitudes, and so worst is kind of hard to define because worst can be largest, worst can be most toxic. And so 5 years ago, we had a bloom that sat with a toxic bloom sitting at the Toledo water intake. And that was problematic because then we had a do not drink advisory for the Toledo water. So that was probably the one that impacted people the most. However, it was not necessarily the largest bloom. We've had larger blooms since then, but they've just not necessarily been either sitting on the water intake or they've not produced toxins.
So when you're not able to drink the water because of these algae blooms, what else do you drink?
For the most part, we were using either bottled water, filtered water. At that point, we actually had the National Guard brought in some of their filtration techniques, and we're providing water, and we would just literally go out and get jugs of water. That was for 3 days where we were advised not to drink the water.
So this is something that happens every year regardless, but the fertilizer stuff make it worse, or how long has this been going on? Is this something like it's all the time and sometimes it's ridiculous, or?
Well, blue-green algae blooms have been documented since the beginning of the 1900s. Basically since Westerners have been here to observe, but they've been much smaller scale up until the 70s. In the 70s, they became really noticeable, and so a big effort was made to reduce phosphorus in household products. So it used to be that if you were cleaning a surface for painting, you would use something called TSP, which is a phosphorus agent, and it would do a great job of preparing the wall, but it would then wash phosphorus directly into the lake. So we don't want that, and so things like that, also phosphorus dishwasher detergents have been taken off, and are not used. So in the 70s and then into the 80s, there's a decrease, as we saw an increase in health through the 80s, and then in the 90s it started getting worse again. And so a lot of that has been a change in fertilizer application and fertilizer types.
What makes the toxicities change? What's the idea behind that? Is it just the thicker it is, the more toxic it is, or how does that work?
There's actually a lot of discussion and research going on right now about what makes a bloom toxic. And so the algae that we look at, blue-green algae, there's microcystin, Anabaena, and Planktothrix, all of which can be toxic, but they don't always turn on that gene that makes them toxic and produces a toxin. One of the things that's been looked at and is being studied right now is actually how much nitrogen is in the water, so it can affect whether or not that turns on that toxicity.
Do you have a number about how, I don't know how to word this, but how many people are hurt or injured from algae blooms?
I don't have that kind of number. The number that we normally give as well, when you look at the Toledo Water Drinking Water Advisory, that affected 400,000 people. So they weren't necessarily harmed, but they were impacted.
Is this, can we change our behaviors more to make this so it's not a factor? Tell us about yeah.
So one of the, I'll tell you. So one of the recommendations that's made right now, there's a phosphorus task force, which is a group of scientists that get together who understand and study the phosphorus issues. And the recommendation was made that 90% of the years we should be at a reduction of 40% under our long-term average or a recent average. And so there are lots of different ways to get to that 40% reduction, most of which rely on looking at best management practices on farm fields. And so some of those are looking at cover crops, some of those looking at buffer strips, some are looking at treating as things come off, maybe moving it through a wetland or something which would actively remove phosphorus. So there's different methods, and one of the things that's changed is a lot of farmers have gone from conventional tilling to no-till. That has some impacts as well. No-till then also doesn't incorporate the phosphorus into the ground when it's then in the next year. So incorporating the phosphorus into the ground so it's not just sitting at the very surface is one of the key things that seems to be that has a high potential for making a difference in reaching that reduction.
I imagine this is going to take cooperation from the farmers, from the governments, are we finding that's happening, or is there pushback, or where are we at with that?
Well, as you can imagine, if you're a farmer, you don't want to be told you're responsible. And especially since most of the farmers are probably closer to the land and really engaged in the environment than a lot of people who live in the city. And so there has to be a cooperative effort. It's not one person doing only by themselves. And one of the things really it's probably the best driver is economic drivers. So obviously phosphorus costs money to put on the soils. And you don't want to be spending more money than you need to fertilize the soil. And so part of that's really education and learning and cooperation and working together rather than finger pointing doesn't get you very far.
Tell us about this year. What are you seeing this year? How does it compare to other years? What are we seeing out there?
Well, this year's had a very wet spring, and so there's a lot of nutrient delivered through wet spring as it came out into the lake, and so we have a significant bloom out right now, and so there's actually bloom actively going on right now. It started up a little earlier than we might have expected, but that seems to be actually a trend where we're getting starting slightly earlier and earlier. So we saw it starting in the middle of July, and it's still actively going on right now. There is some toxin associated with the bloom, but it's not at its most toxic level, and it's also not sitting right. The same way we had a combination of effects the year we had the water advisory, which was a north wind bringing all the algae to sit right, basically trapping against the water intake. We've had actually a lot more later season rain, so it's flushing more material through. And we also have a complicating effect, which because it was so wet this spring, a lot of farmers in Northwest Ohio and Southern Michigan didn't plant. And so if they didn't plant, they also didn't apply fertilizer. So instead of being fresh fertilizer running off, there are many farm fields that have what are called legacy phosphorus. So phosphorus which is applied in previous years and still in the ground. And so that's still running off. But a lot of those farms didn't necessarily have fresh phosphorus applied or fresh nitrogen applied. And so those farms, it's an interesting case because now we can take a look and see if we can find out what kind of difference that made. And that's going to be studied over the next year.
What is this all doing to like the wildlife, like the fish and all the animals that are around there?
So obviously when you have a lot of thick bloom of fish that one, don't like the microcystin are not going to be in that area. But a lot of times the fish actually end up congregating kind of the edge of the bloom, and so sometimes the And you see our charter fishermen, what's really affecting is charter fishermen because people don't like going out and fishing in this green muck, even if it's good fishing. But sometimes on the edge of the bloom, there'll be more fish there just because they have but a lot of times if the fish structure, the community itself can be affected just by the lack of light and or it's food they don't prefer.
What else is that?
That's not something I'm a specialist on.
So what are we trending? How's the trend looking? Is it looking like these are going to get bigger? Are our signs pointing to that so far? Is it too early to tell? Where are we at?
Well, we've started seeing some implementation of trying to reduce phosphorus, but it's really too early to say how well, because some of these things take multiple years. So for instance, if someone is taking crops out of rotation, or if they're putting have to have a CRP set up, or if they're putting in, changing their application rates, it may take years before that's really noticeable. It won't necessarily be noticeable the first year. And also it takes a critical mass before it starts really being seen in the lake.
Are we getting to that critical mass?
Not yet. I mean, it's approaching, I think we're getting closer to it, but I think there's one of the things the governor of Ohio has been really pushing is actually pushing more, so there's an H2O Program, which is really looking at how we can affect practices and also how we can incentivize better practices.
Is there communication between farmers, your researchers on the lake? Is that happening yet, or how is that happening? If you know, right?
There are some working groups and communications that go back and forth, and there's also a lot of informal communication. So we have people on staff who are in our department who used to be on staff who on farms locally. So we actually talk to different farmers, and so there is some. It's not all done in a vacuum. We also go out and different researchers at the university work directly with the farmers and trying to gauge interest on, well, how likely are you to apply one of these different techniques? And so that's actually done from both a social science, how likely is someone to actually apply this, but also from a science point of view of, well, what is the best practice? And then ultimately down even to the drinking water scale of, well, if I do drink the toxin, how it is actually affecting me.
We're going to take this back to the middle of Michigan.
Okay.
And we're going to put it out there. Why do these people need to be concerned about it? Why do people need to be concerned about this?
Well, when you look at water quality in general, I mean, you look at the Great Lakes. Great Lakes are a great water resource. Lake Erie is the most productive fishery of the Great Lakes, and so when you look at the Great Lakes production, if you're a sport fisherman in Michigan, well, oftentimes will be coming down here for walleye and perch, and so that makes a difference. And also, if there's no fishery here, that puts pressure to go fish someplace else, and so you may find people coming up into the small lakes in Michigan instead. But also just general water quality. There's been some discussion, for instance, in Toledo, where else can we get water from? And one of the places is looking at is some of the shallow aquifers that are in northwest Ohio and southern Michigan, and so when you're starting competing for water, that can create potential problems.
Okay. All right. Anything else you guys got? Anything else we missed? Anything we're...
I'll talk about a couple things. One of the things University of Toledo actively is doing is we actually have a monitoring program. Dr. Bridgman goes out and his crew go out every 2 weeks or a week, depending on the time of year, and actually sample. They sample, and they've been doing this now for the last 15 years. Or so, and so they have active sampling that goes on, and they go out, take samples, find out what the algae community is. And so one of our ways that we know whether or not something is bigger or smaller than it was 15 years ago is because we've had this active ongoing monitoring program. And so Dr. Bridgman's gone out, and he goes out, or his students have gone out and go out and measure exactly what's going on and he goes back to the same spots every week. And so you say the same spot in the lake, okay, it's the GPS location, we find the same spot, make measurements at the same spot, so we know what's changing. And the other thing is we actually have, the University of Toledo has put out a measuring buoy, and there's actually a series of measuring buoys. University of Toledo runs one, NOAA GLERL up in Ann Arbor runs one, the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor runs one. Then the City of Toledo actually has a monitoring buoy right outside of their intake. And so unlike 5 years ago where things were kind of caught off guard, there's a lot more monitoring going on, so that if there is a toxin increase or a bloom increase now, we see that hours to days beforehand, as opposed to afterwards in making a measurement at the water plant. And so when the water comes in from the water intake in the lake, because that's where Toledo gets their water, it's about 2 miles off in the lake, it comes in through a pipe, comes in through a pump station, then finally comes to the treatment center. There's 6 or 12 hours lead time. If they know what's going on at that intake center, then they can do something about it at the treatment center.
So did it take the Toledo incident, the water incident there, to kind of ramp things up around here, get more money, get things moving?
It mobilized a little more resources, but at that point there still was Toledo. The only reason we know that we had a problem was that Toledo was voluntarily testing. It was not a mandated thing. It was actually a voluntary testing thing. They were going through and making sure that they were looking for the toxin. And I can tell you the chemist, the day she actually brought up that test and it was positive, above the limit, she was glad she was testing, but it was not a call she wanted to make to her boss. And so the fact that Toledo was doing that testing shows that, trying to be out on the front, and then that's freed up the water crisis, freed up a little more money to make it even more possible to then prevent future problems. So one of those things, they have been putting in a new treatment system, an ozonation system, which will come online next year at the water treatment plant, and that makes that's going to be a significant improvement. Right now, they actually use activated charcoal, activated carbon, which also removes the microcystin as well. The overall quality of the water, it's a really cutting edge system that they've actually been able to implement now.
Okay, so you guys were able to kind of tell them ahead of time what was coming, and that's the whole plan of doing all this.
Yeah, and now when we have something that says, hey, there's a bloom out there, one, there's a much better communication. The city actually has an advisory that says, oh, there's microcystin, there's this toxin in the water in the lake. It's not in the drinking water, it's not in here, and it's below the limit. Or there's a toxin in the lake above what you would drink if you were just drinking straight from the lake. No one drinks straight from the lake. But at the treatment level, it's still clean. And so there's a much better communication that wasn't there. And now, instead of testing weekly, during the algae season, they're testing daily.
Awesome.
So.
Okay. All right. Can you do a couple more things for us?
Sure.
So what we'd like you to do now, and this guys, you could probably go off the tripod for this. I already tried it out. So can you kind of just, we can have you pull up the drone or put it back up, just kind of tell what you do with that.
Okay, sure.
And then if you wouldn't mind, could we walk you across the street, or is there
Yeah,
a place
sure.
where you can kind of just tell us what we're looking at? And,
Sure.
Okay, kind of describe it like that. So we're just going to keep the wireless on. All right, and you guys can just roll. Actually, go ahead and shoulder this. It's fine.
Yeah, it sounds like it gets fuzzy every now and then, just like.
Or you get a little bumps.
It was like just now for like 2 seconds.
Probably because he was moving.
Probably because I bumped this wireless.
Yeah.
If I do this, it's probably going to do that.
Yeah. So you're gonna get that from wireless from time to time. Okay. All right. Cool. And so this is where we're gonna get some nap hops with it, and just gonna talk about. We're not so much interested in the sound bites. We're gonna use them, but more of the B-roll stuff. Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So Haley, why don't you get right over there? Start on the drone. There you go. And then just flick questions at him. He can tell you what he's doing. So what do you guys do with the drone?
Yeah, so what this is actually a drone we take out and we fly it, actually can fly it from the boat. It's a waterproof system so that actually it's landed in the water and we're fine with that. So we actually have what's called a spectrometer on the bottom here, and this is the instrument that actually we're making measurements with. It's actually not very big, it's only about this big. And so we're able to fly this out over the lake, and it flies basically a transect. So we'll take it up, we can either program it or I fly it out away from the boat. They'll fly it in a grid or in a pattern, bring it back to the boat, and then we can measure what's underneath it. We can basically make a map of what we're looking at. And why do we want to do that from a drone? Well, if you look on a day like today, it's nice and cloudy outside. Satellite image is going to see the top of the clouds. We're supposed to have NASA's supposed to be flying an airborne image. The airborne imager flies at 7,000 feet. The clouds are at 1,000. I don't think they flew today. So when we want to go out in a day like today, or if we want to go back out on a quick response, this is kind of an ideal tool. It's also great not just for the lake, because we have all kinds of algae problems on smaller reservoirs and lakes as well. In Ohio, there's a lake called Grand Lake St. Mary, which has a cyanobacterial bloom in it a large portion of the year. It basically drains all agricultural and urban land right into it, and it blooms pretty much every year, very, very strongly, much more strongly than Lake Erie. And so that's become a cyanobacteria and the blue-green algae have become an issue for water resource managers. So if you're looking at a reservoir, surface water intake, that becomes a real issue. And a lot of Ohio draws water from surface water intakes. As we're looking at smaller and smaller, they're not necessarily good targets for satellite. Lake Erie is a great target for a satellite. A small reservoir is not. And so this thing's nice. We can actually program it. Like it has GPS on the top. It can actually locate where it is. It can tell how high it is. It can actually fly a grid. We can just set it up and program it, and it will fly exactly what we want it to. The one disadvantage of that is when you're on a boat and you're on anchor, the boat rotates on anchor. And so we have actually had it sent out. It came, we lost communication with it. So what does it do? It returns to its starting point and sploosh. But again, that's why we make a waterproof drone as opposed to a drone that would actually suffer from that. And so we had to fish it out, but that's about all we had to do. So one of the things, let's see, I'll just grab this really quick. So the instrument we're flying in here is all the size it is. It's a spectrometer, and what it's doing is it's actually measuring light in 100 different wavelengths. And so we're measuring visible light and near-infrared light in 100 different wavelengths and making a measurement of that. And because we know the measurement of that, we can actually then determine what type of algae is in the water, how much algae is in the water, whether there's sediment in the water, and other things as well. So this is the key tool, and what's making this possible is the miniaturization of this. I have another setup which is bigger than that. So it's a full backpack. That would be 10 years ago would have been the standard. This is now doing the same thing. And it actually uses a little Raspberry Pi computer as its driving computer for that one. Other questions?
No, I think that's good. Can you put it away for us?
Yeah, sure.
This will give us some B-roll
Yep.
to use. Okay.
Throw that back in there. And if it looks, did I put that in backwards? I think I probably put that in backwards. That's why it didn't fit right. If it looks like you're using a lot of hobby grade equipment, it's because I am.